If I can have your attention. I'm Ron Lyons, I'm the Vice President of the Society, and today I'm standing in for our President, Rob Muscat. Just a couple of admin points before we start. Would you please switch your phones to either off or mute? The toilets are out the doors behind us and to the left, and in the event that we have to evacuate the building, the evacuation route is again out the doors behind us and to your right, and across and up the ramp that you probably came in from Liverpool Street with a rendezvous spot near the fountain. Our speaker today is Dr. David Martin, and his subject is an Australian country town at war, Armidale, 1914 to 1918. David is a fellow of our society and one of its counsellors. He holds a doctorate in history from the University of New England. He's the author of Germany, 1918 to 1945, and over the years he's written a substantial number of articles, reviews of books covering the period from the 1588 Spanish Armada to Australia's involvement in East Timor, so quite a scope. David grew up in Armidale and has had a long interest in the community's World War I experience, which began for him as a child attending an Anzac Day dawn service at the local war memorial. Would you please welcome Dr. David Martin to the podium.
The talk you're about to hear is not a military history, it's a social history about Australian society during wartime. It's about the impact war made on our home front. Specifically, it's about an Australian country town and what it experienced during the First World War, with many of the themes raised being of relevance to the wider Australian society of that period. Okay. As far as the main themes are concerned, Armidale was a community which was keen to join the fight against Germany and its allies. It's believed in the justice of the cause, it's believed it was fighting a moral cause. And it was immensely proud of those of its citizens who volunteered for service in the first AIF. Now, most of that sounds pretty unremarkable, but these days, academic historians, Australian academic historians, are of the view that we shouldn't have been fighting in this war. Well, that was certainly not the case of the locals, and they believed in the justice of their cause. So that's on a positive level. Yet it was a community which would become bitterly divided along religious and class lines over issues such as conscription. The fact that it was divided along religious lines is not surprising. It was divided on religious lines before the war. It was gradually repressed, but it surfaced again in 1967 and continued. But despite that, the emphasis I want to place is that it was a community that believed that Australia should be involved in the war, and it continued to be so, despite how some academics, many academics in universities today, would argue the case. They are tending towards a pacifist view, and war is unacceptable, and they try to make war out to be pretty terrible, which it is, I suppose. But this is more of a positive story, hopefully, than that. Okay, there is Armidale in northern New South Wales on the New England tablelands. The last time there was a census taken before the war, the township had a population of a bit less than 5,000. There were 3 towns in the area, Armidale, Euroa and Kingsgrove, and the split between the urban and the rural population was about 50-50, a bit more living in the cities than there was in the towns than in the countryside. 80% of the town's residents had been born in Australia, but you might keep in mind that about 4% were born in Ireland, about 8% in England, and to round off the figures, about 1% were born in Scotland. Here is Armidale, about the time we're dealing with, looking from east to west along the main street of Beatty Street on the left. You have the Imperial Hotel reflecting an attitude of the time. The next place along your left is the post office, which I'll be mentioning later on. Something happens on the footsteps there. And then straight across the road where the clock tower is, you can see there, that's the local courthouse. I'm not certain what was happening on the 25th of March. There's a 1903. There's a photograph showing the pride the community has in itself. They've got their own band. One of its favourites in its repertoire was Soldiers of the Queen. So everybody has turned out in their Sunday best. About 3 blocks back, you have a precinct where there are churches kind of around Central Park. You've got St Peter's Anglican Cathedral and St Mary's Catholic Cathedral. It really, technically, I'm talking about it being a country town, which it was, but because there were bishops installed there, it could call itself a city. So it's the city of Armidale as it is today. Now, as I said, in this area where the churches are, and they're around Central Park, here's a war memorial. I just want to make a point here about how I'm differing from modern academics in Australian universities typically. What is the significance of a war memorial? Well, the standard interpretation of a war memorial as far as academics are concerned is it's about grief, about mass mourning. And that's why people established these things. As I said, there's a theme of them trying to run down war, and war is not a legitimate thing for a government to do. And when people go off to war and get killed, the community is in mourning. Well, during the Boer War, Armidale sent off about 59 volunteers and none were killed. This is not a memorial to the dead at all. The community was proud of its young men who went off to fight for Australia and present Australia in a good light to the rest of the world. So this is one of the ways that I'm differing from academics today. As I said, they tend to be pacifist. War is not a good thing, and they try to present it in the most horrible of ways. Now, on the 24th of August 1900, that's when the idea was raised that Armidale needed a war memorial. Some troops were being welcomed home from having fought in South Africa in the Boer War. Now, this has had some universal themes that were raised by the local Member of Parliament. Okay, there were those who thought that Australia had no right to take part in the Boer War. I think you can make out a pretty good argument for that. There's no national interest involved. But by offering assistance to Britain, so he's trying to justify it, when the time came, Australia would receive the protection of the British Navy. And I think that's fairly familiar to you, surely, that these days we go off and fight with the Americans at the drop of a hat when our particular national interests aren't involved. So it's a transactional thing. We're going off and fighting in return for the protection that we hope will receive from a major power. In those days it was the British. Now the particular thing that concerned Wilson and other politicians, and perhaps some of the locals who were saying is, this is why we need the protection of the British Navy. And this is why the locals, one of the reasons of the jigsaw puzzle of peace of why we should be at war, is that we needed the British Navy against invasion and possibly annexation by other nations. There was a fear in the back of people's minds in those days about white Australia and coming under threat from an invasion. And I'll develop that theme. So it's mentioned here in 1900, and it's around previously in Australian history, but it will particularly surface in 1916 and 17 with the conscription referendum. And increasingly as time goes by, it's the Japanese that are coming into focus. Initially, during the gold rushes, it was the Chinese in the 1850s. But as time goes by, and due to particular developments at around the turn of the century and a little bit beyond, it's the Japanese. And I'm suggesting that it's about this racist thing, if you look at the cartoon there, that Australia, a young country, is afraid of the Asian masses to the north. Initially, it was the Chinese, but there's a variation on that during the First World War and the conscription referenda, and it will be the Japanese that they're fearful of. Now, giving them the heebie-jeebies even more so, a little bit beyond this, on the 30th of January 1902, Britain and Japan signed a military alliance. So, depending upon Britain for our defence, Then they sign an alliance with the Japanese. The British aim being to reduce its naval commitments in the east. So they're pulling back their resources towards the Atlantic. And much to the distress of some Australians, the Japanese are going to be given free rein in the Pacific, or that's what it seemed to be like. So this fear they had is kind of somewhat increased by this. This is in the backgrounds of certain people's minds. And then to make it even worse, in 1905, the Japanese defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. Okay, now look, this is not a big deal, but it's a subliminal consideration as to why Australia should be at war. This is one of the reasons why we should be at war. It's probably dormant in people's minds, but I'm suggesting that will come to the fore, particularly in 1916-17. Here's Armidale. Must be 1917 or 18, you can work that out. There's a mock-up of a tank there that weren't operational until mid-1916. Okay, they got the people out in the street, they're trying to raise money for the war effort. Okay, so as part of the British Empire, Armidale would be at war with Germany and its allies from the 4th of August until the 11th of November 1918. Now, as far as the official version of this from the City of Armidale Council is concerned, patriotism was the keynote, solidly standing behind the empire. I think that's got a lot going to it. We weren't fighting as a nation, we were fighting for the empire, and I've suggested that they're fairly constant in that, and they believe it's the correct cause. The next part is more controversial. Differences of opinion and prejudices were forgotten. It's largely to do with religion. Enmities were thrown to one side. There was no thought of political belief, no bitterness of sect or creed. That's correct and incorrect. Initially, with the war breaking out, these differences were put aside, but they resurrected themselves quite in a bitter way in 1916-17 into 1918, and it became a divided community. But despite these divisions, the community paradoxically continued to believe it was fighting the good fight. It was morally correct in taking on the Germans for reasons that I'm going to develop. There's no mention here of that thing about racism, etc. That will come to the fore later on. Okay, the war itself. Well, it starts with this person, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. On the 28th of June 1914, he and his wife Sophie are assassinated by a Serb terrorist, Gavrilo Princip, and their results following that, the July crisis, a diplomatic crisis in 1914, and we're heading to the outbreak of war on the 4th of August. And what were Armidale people thinking about this war? Well, they weren't thinking about the war at all. One of the things, the leading things that happened in Armidale at this time was on Sunday, the 12th of July, and was the anniversary of a battle fought more than 200 years previously, the Battle of Armidale, and it was fought in Ireland. So what the heck did this have with current affairs and in Armidale? The Armidale Chronicle reported about the large gathering on the 12th of July of local members of the Orange Lodge and the Protestant Alliance in their regalia, commemorating the overthrow of the papacy in Great Britain in the Battle of 1691 Armidale by the forces of William of Orange. This was accompanied by Methodist and Presbyterian ministers of religion denouncing the claims of the Roman Catholic Church to universal supremacy in obedience. Now, I'm just amazed this is a leading article in a local newspaper. You don't hear those things these days. But anyways, the biggest news in town. They weren't thinking about the war coming. This was on their minds. And on that Sunday morning, there was a large gathering of the Orange Lodge, etc., in St Paul's Presbyterian Church in the centre part of Armidale. And that evening, it's in Stephen's Methodist Church, and from in between, I presume, they were parading around with drums to the fore in Central Park, confronting straight across the road was the Catholic Church, and they were on the front foot, and they were kind of asserting their dominance in the town. And it was a conservative Protestant town, if you like. Now, there's a breakdown as far as the census was concerned, the last one that dealt with these matters. as to the religious breakdown of the community. Now, balancing out this Protestant on the front foot approach was the Catholic Church's association with the Irish. The local Catholic bishop was Irish born. He was the patron of St Patrick's Day sports that was held each year in March. So this is the equivalent, but much more watered down. I'm not confrontationist of what the Protestants were doing. And they delivered talks when the time was appropriate on St Patrick's Day, such as St Patrick found Ireland a pagan country and set about Christianising it. And then they would add the nettle at the end, and then they sent missionaries to England to Christianise it too. So, just having a shot at the Anglicans. And this is the type of division that I'm suggesting has been in Armidale up until this time and will continue, but it will be repressed a little while at the beginning of the war in 1914 and 1915. So the Catholics are about 30%, almost 70% are religions of the Protestants, most of which originate in Britain. Now, how did Armidale understand the war? And were the locals supportive of Australia's involvement in it, and why? I don't know if I'm going to be able to explain this very well, but it's got a lot to do with the use of the word propaganda. The standard interpretation by some academics today is that Australia was tricked into going to war by a British propaganda machine, which presented German actions at the outbreak of the war as pretty horrific, as massacres, etc., are being conducted. The argument implying that this was lying, saying things that happened that had never happened. The British presenting the Germans as demonic, and it was very successful according to this interpretation. So successful indeed that eventually you've got the United States coming on the side of Britain in the war. But Armidale also receives this. Okay, the most recent research suggests the British didn't have a propaganda machine. The British government was interested in spreading the word and getting support, but it didn't make up things like massacres, etc. Okay, what did happen, I would suggest, is that most of this propaganda came as a result of news coming from Belgian refugees from their country when it was invaded at the beginning of the war. It got into the hands of British newspaper publishers, and then they wrote up sometimes sensational stories. Then via the wire service, papers like the Armidale Express got hold of it. Now, I'm still not finished that story, but the key part will come at the end of it. So I would suggest that what I'm about to read to you, you can read there for yourself, is an example of propaganda. Germany was, this is what the Armidale Express is telling its readers. Germany was motivated by an insatiable lust for territorial expansion and banal desire for world domination. Germany was the imperial apotheosis of murder and tyranny. For the sake of territorial aggrandizement, it practically exterminated the population of Belgium. Well, that's certainly propaganda. The little people so peace-loving, industrious and thrifty. And through its sinking of the Lusitania, Germany demonstrated itself to be only too truly the beast of the Revelation. Now, that's the type of thing that you can also see in that poster to the left by Norman Lindsay. This is about Belgium. You can see there two central German soldiers. I would suggest if you look closely, you can see bottles of champagne. One's holding two in his hand, another one's got two on his hip, and he's not holding the baby aloft, he's holding another champagne bottle there. So you've got this barbaric invasion going on, they're looting and whatever. You've got women lying at their feet, the implication being they've been raped. Then you've got this other well-known piece of a story that came out at the time of babies on bayonets. There's another thing about a soldier there being bayoneted to war. And then, if you look at the flag in the background, it's in German saying, God is with us. So, this is the type of thing that probably the locals had. This is why they needed to go to war. Okay, it is propaganda, but I suggested that the British spent propaganda in the forms of just getting together what actually did happen to try and get people on their side. And this is what did happen. The most recent research indicates that in August 1914, 5,000 to 6,000 unarmed Belgian civilians were killed by the Germans. 20,000 plus buildings were destroyed in places like Dinant and Louvain. And there is a picture of what happened at Louvain's library. It was deliberately set on fire by German troops using petrol, the 25th of August 1914. These are the types of messages that came through to the people of Armidale. That's the type of reason why they thought they should be involved in the war. It was a moral reason. And what connection is there between what I'm saying and the people of Armidale? Well, I suggest that's the connection. As a result of hearing about these things, about reading these things, and I'm saying it was a reality of what did happen, over the first 12 months of the war, the people of Armidale donated £8,768 to the Belgian Relief Fund. So what does that mean in real terms? Well, in 1920, they collected money for a local war memorial, and they raised £2,250. That was only a fraction of the amount of money they raised to try and help out the refugees from Belgium and all of that type of thing. I would suggest that that's the reason why they thought that Australia should be involved in the war, despite all these other factors. And despite the fact that academics saying, well, it wasn't our war to fight. They were in there for a good moral reason. Now, Stephen Batsey, who I think is pretty good on this, this is the way he puts it. The British did not need to invent either the scale, they didn't need to invent massacres, or the threat of German atrocities. They existed. British propaganda was powered by German actions. What actually did happen? German conduct of the war continued to hand the Allies propaganda victories at regular intervals. So Patsy is saying, they used propaganda, but it was based upon fact. You will see what happens with Belgium. Now, what about the Lusitania? On the 7th of May 1915, about 2,000 passengers on board the Lusitania and about 1,200 perished, including 94 children and 35 babies. Now, as a result of these episodes, as a result of kind of like what the Armidale Express is saying, the people of Armidale had this attitude, that Britain was the reluctant belligerent. She was animated by ideals of liberty, justice and fair play. Her ultimate aim was to promote the peace, progress and happiness of the world. So that's why we had to be Britain's partner in the war and we joined with her. Now, if you wanted, you can find plenty of holes in that argument. But I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in what the people thought. And that's what they believed. They were fighting the good fight. Without going into all of this, so I've come to the point for the first half of the war, 1914 and 15, perhaps into 16, religious and associated differences were subordinated to the community's contribution to the war effort. For example, on the 23rd of May 1915, which happened to be Empire Day, Armidale's Catholic born bishop, Patrick O'Connor, gave a sermon of a patriotic nature in which he pointed to what the Germans had done in Belgium, which was pretty bad, he's telling his congregation. Now, for an Irishman who don't like the English very much, he then made this statement showing how much there was a truce on. He talked about the magnificent deeds of the British Army in the great struggle for the Empire's existence. So he was even aligned himself with supporting the British Empire. Now, earlier this month, May 1915, there had been reports about the Australians Anzac landing at Gallipoli. So he acknowledged the splendid record of the Australian troops. They would make a glowing page in history and they urged the remaining young men in the Armidale community to enlist. Now, the Anglican bishop had a similar speech on the sermon to deliver on the same day, but I thought I'd pull this one in too. Lots of sermons have been given of this nature. So the Reverend Canon Garnsey, the Anglican minister, he gave a talk with others on the anniversary of the outbreak of the war, and he said Armidale enjoyed the right of self-government under the British Empire. Would that be the case under Germany? Well, he implied it wouldn't. If Germany was defeated, well, so much for our liberties and the Westminster system of government, etc. Now, Armidale was involved in fighting a just war, but it was also a necessary war if they were to put off unfortunate consequences. It was necessary if we wished to preserve ourselves as a free people, which I keep kind of think is summarised in, there's again another propaganda poster, but it seems to summarise pretty much the fear that the community had of Armidale of what was going to happen if Germany ended up winning the war. So you can see there all the blood kind of covering Europe, and would Australia be next in line? Okay, Australia's contribution to the war effort, the district's AI volunteers. So how do we find out about them? Well, that's in Central Park, not far away from the War Memorial, is this Armidale's First World War Memorial, and in that Central Park are all those names. You can't see very clearly there. That's the names of as many as they could of the AI volunteers who went off to war. There are 903 names there, if my adding up is correct, when I went around and had a look at it. So you've got all these names everywhere, and I'd point out again, at a point that I've made before, you will not find next to any of those names an asterisk or an indication that they had been killed in war. My argument is that the community was proud of its young men who went off to fight in what they thought was the good fight. So the 903 names, I've been able to track down to about 588, and I'm calling that the Armidale District AIF cohort for statistical purposes. One of the names, the most famous name in Armidale for this period, is G.F. Braun. And there's Lieutenant Colonel George Braun. And I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but I'll go through it. The central document is his enlistment form that he produced. And I'm having a bit of difficulty reading it here, but anyway, he was born in England. He's 48 years old when he enlisted, 48 years and 2 months old. It then goes on to say he was a general merchant, one of the biggest businessmen in town, but he was also the local member of parliament, the MLA. He had a wife, and then it goes down to say that in the citizens' militia, he was a lieutenant colonel. On the right-hand document, he's applying for a commission a few days after he put in his application there. He's applying for a commission and he's recommended to be a lieutenant colonel, and he goes on to be in charge of the AIS 2nd Infantry Battalion. Now, I use this type of information to draw up a graph, as you'll see in a second, and the information, I use all that in various ways, but if you look at the top of the central page, it joined up on the 17th of August in 1914. Now, when you get the 588 dossiers together, that's the type of enlistment you get. It reflects the type of pattern, with one exception of what happened across Australia. Almost identical, except for there are not two peaks. The difference in this rural community is that a lot of people were enlisting, and then there was a delay towards the end of 1915 before the rest came along. They'd already decided to enlist, so it seems to me, but there were crops to be brought in and sheep to be shorn, and that's why there was that delay. If it wasn't for that, the pattern would be the same as for Australia. There would be just one peak. Now, but first of all, there's a bit of a rush to enlist, and it's with people like Braun. There's British imperial reasons. But what I'd emphasise is it's kind of limited. You get this initial rush, and then it levels out. But then you get a totally different pattern later on. And the pattern results, it comes as a result of, we'll make it quite concrete. On the 8th of May, the people of Armidale read reports such as that by Ellis Ashmead Bartlett of the Gallipoli landing. Now, the first response to this would have been one of great relief. Why relief? Because they'd been receiving letters from overseas of Australian troops playing up in Egypt. There'd been a report from Charles Bean, the official war correspondent, of a boatload of them being sent back, and they were really kind of quite concerned that we're going to disgrace ourselves on the world stage. and they didn't. And Ashmead Bartlett said, look, these blokes are comparable to the British troops in what they're achieving. And as far as the locals are concerned, well, the British troops were the best in the world, so they're being told that their troops were the best in the world. And they're not only told that, but they were told in this article by Ashmead Bartlett that when they landed, all the Turks ran away. So kind of, we've got supermen over there, and there's great relief and pride. I'm suggesting that that would have helped with the enlistment considerably, but I'm not saying would have helped, it did. And look how it takes off. And then 3 days later, newspaper reports carried this thing about the Lusitania being sunk, with all those people being drowned. 3 days later. And so what you've got is pride in your own military achievement of the locals, and you've got this moral outrage as a result of what the Germans are doing. I'm suggesting that's why people enlisted in the numbers that they did. Now, just to look a little bit more at Colonel Braund. On the 17th of August, he enlisted, one of the very first to enlist. He's commander of the 2nd Battalion, sails for overseas. I found it interesting, he took two of his own horses with him, his own horses. Then they say later on, sorry, we can't return the horses. And then this happens, adding to why people would be enlisting. He was killed in action at Gallipoli after midnight on the 4th of May 1915. Details not immediately available, subsequently reported, and in darkness, being slightly deaf, he failed to respond to a challenge from one of his own champions and was shot in the head. So that caused, a degree of distress, but I think it would also have contributed to why people decided we must join up. We've got to support the side. I want to just make it aside, and I want to talk more generally now about the character of the troops. In March 1916, Braund's personal possessions returned to his family in Australia by Thomas Cook and Company. They had the contract. And whereas the Americans tried to return the bodies of overseas, troops killed overseas Australians, don't, but at least they tried to return their possessions. Officers had much more things they were carrying around with them than ordinary troops. He had 2 portcases, kit bag, and a locked tin trunk. Okay, this is what I want to draw to you. So at the end of these dossiers, you get this list of things that are returned to families. They'd have to sign it and return it to Victoria Barracks in Melbourne. And I'm now diverging away from Braund and just talking about the general character of the local troops, typically delivered 6 to 9 months after a battlefield fatality. Not always, various reasons why, but many of them did. 18% were killed, and of those that they could get their personal possessions, of the locals, 57% of the consignments of personal effects returned to the next of kin in Armidale cohort contained various types of religious items. The reason I'm raising this is because historians such as Bulgarian said they weren't interested in religion. They came from a society that wasn't interested in religion. Well, that's absolute rubbish. This community was interested in religion, and it was reflected in the troops. From this conservative area, 57% had religious items in their possession, such as those types of things. Now, I've looked at a community down in Sydney here, Rockdale, using the same technique, and 45% of that left-wing contingent, they had religious items too. So anyway, for what it's worth, I'm suggesting that religion was never as important in Australian history as it was at this time. And it was reflected in the troops and what they were carrying with them. Okay. Now, look, I haven't got time to go through all this, but if you like to flick your eyes through that, that's a breakdown by occupation that I've been able to get from this 588 I've identified in the cohort. So you've gone from farm labourers and station hands to various types. You go eventually to various types of professionals, etc. I'll just mention, I found it interesting, you're not going to find any shearers there, because shearers weren't local. They were coming from places like Sydney or other places, and they wander around the countryside doing their work, sometimes station hands too. But I would suggest that that would be a fairly typical cross-section of a country contingent. They weren't hayseeds. They were reflected society in general. Okay, we'll pause more on this one. It was pretty young. More than 75% were younger than 25 when they enlisted. Slightly more than 20% were aged between 25 and 35, and about 5% were aged 36 or older. They're also thrown in there young boys, 16 to 17, who enlisted and lied about their age. The average age was about 23 years and 6 months, I think. The oldest member of the cohort was 48-year-old George Braun. The cohort was overwhelmingly single, slightly over 91% were unmarried when they enlisted. Why do I want to emphasise that? Well, one of the most prominent of modern day stories said, there was lots of married men and then they got killed and they left a widow, and typically they had 2 children, they were orphans, and that's why we have a legacy to look after this, this terrible distress in the community. Well, again, they're emphasising the negative, and it actually wasn't the case. They were largely single men. Now, that doesn't make their deaths any less, but the distress in the community wasn't as great as some of our modern day academics want to suggest. About 55% of the Armidale cohort became casualties of war. There were some, although not many, of these casualties who were prisoners of war by perhaps the Turks or by the Germans later on. More than 36% were murdered, mainly as a result of artillery. Okay, I'm going to pause on this one a little bit. 15 were afflicted by shell shock, about 2.55% of the cohort. 10 being invalided out of the army, with 5 returning to duty following an average of 9 weeks medical treatment. That's just my going through the enlistment papers, their dossiers. Well, one modern historian says up to 25% was suffering from shell shock. Again, they're trying to emphasise, which I think it's a kind of an estimate, without any factual basis for it. One Australian said about 14 to 15%. I only came across 2.55%. Undoubtedly, it was more than that, because shell shock only became apparent perhaps years afterwards. But anyway, but bad enough was the fact that 18.37% would never return to Australia, having been killed in action. And just 5 of those killed were married men. So not many married men, not many widows, not many orphans. How was Armidale directly affected by the war effort? Well, I've just explained how they were by these types of things, but there's another way to look at it. I mean geographically affected close by. In 1915 and 16, the AIF established a camp in Armidale. That's the Armidale Showground to the east of Armidale. And if you go through newspaper reports, you get these figures for how many people are there. Now, when the war broke out, you went to the local police station, you had a rail pass, and that gave you a free trip down to Sydney, to Victoria Barracks, wherever, and then you went for a medical to see if you could get into the army. And you may have got in, or you may not have. They might have rejected you. They were fairly strict to start with. And so there were people going down all the way down to Sydney, and then they weren't accepted. They could come back, so it was a bit disruptive. Eventually, they decided to establish a training ground for the north of the state and other places throughout the state, but in the north of the state in Armidale. So you'd go there, and they decided, well, they'd do their initial training there. And then they were doing such a good job, supposedly reports were, they decided, well, rather than train them and then send them off to Sydney and then overseas as replacements, we'll actually raise the whole battalion there. And you see their February, March, they reach about battalion level. And then they sent off the 33rd Battalion, and because it was raised in Armidale, they referred to it as the 33rd Armidale Battalion. Then for the rest of the year, they continue to train and send off replacements overseas. Now, as far as the locals were concerned, what did this mean? Well, one of the things it meant that there were a lot of drunken soldiers around it, particularly on Sundays. Why Sundays? Because pubs were supposed to be closed on Sundays. But the soldiers worked out that if you paid for accommodation in the hotel on Saturday night, you could drink as much as you wanted on the premises on Sunday. So there were lots of soldiers there, so the respectable citizens of Armidale, I wasn't impressed by that. And also by the time, the numbers were such that there's a fair amount of prostitution associated with the the local camp. And so the enraged local people, some of them anyway, who didn't like this, went to the local police station and complained about it. Some people liked it because, as far as the camp is concerned, it was good business supplying it with food and whatever. Okay, then in March 1916, off the battalion goes, and the Armidale people follow it closely. They're proud of their battalion and they're keen to find out how it's going. Letters, the way they find out is letters from overseas. And at least 100 letters are reproduced I've been able to read in the Armidale newspapers. First of all, they're under the heading for King and Country, and then later in the war, they changed the heading to For God, King and Country. And so that's how they know how their own men are going off. Okay, there are others at the 33rd Battalion, but they're very proud of this battalion. I'm with this theme of there is not a disillusionment with war. Far from it. They believe they're fighting the good fight, and they continue to believe so. Okay, this is where discord comes into the community. In 1916 and 1917, conscription referenda were issued. Should the government have the right to force young men into the armed forces against their will? Now, I just want to issue a word of warning here. Some academics these days say that it's not really, that's not really what the people are asking. It's giving them an opportunity to say whether they oppose the war or not. And if you vote no to conscription, you're really saying you don't want Australia to fight in the war. Well, I suggest that's rubbish. There were some people who were opposed to the war, but certainly not in a place like Armidale. It was simply a matter of, do you just vote yes and have people go into the armed forces, or no, they didn't have to and they preserved their civil liberties. That's what the thing was about, not whether you're in favour of Australia being in the war or not, as some people, some historians have argued. Okay, there's the enlistment thing. You can see there that not many people are enlisting in the war for war service in those later months of the year. There was an official estimate of about 400. There was a census held. Now, the Prime Minister from October 1915 was Billy Hughes. He's born in Wales. He'd been long supporting compulsory military service, and he wanted that power to force people into the armed forces. He held the conscription referenda across Australia on the 28th of October 1916. Notice that there's an upturn in enlistments. He didn't have public opinion polls in those days. The people believing, they thought that it would be passed, a yes vote. So some people got in early and enlisted rather than being forced afterwards against their will. And then it was rejected. And then you can see it bottom out. The only reason for a blip later on is I think probably in 1918 when the German offensive was going full steam ahead in France, people were afraid the Germans might win. Anyway, there was going to be a second referendum on the 20th of December 1917. And it's over this that a lot of discord will come into this Armidale community. Okay, that gets you a bit of an idea of some of the arguments we used on the yes side. For example, front, bottom there, it says, we've got to support the British. We said we'd support them to the last man and the last shilling. We have to honour that. We've got to, left-hand side, we've got to support the boys in the trenches. There's a specific vote about women, etc. But what I want to emphasise for the sake of this talk is the top right-hand side. Vote yes to preserve white Australia. Vote yes to preserve white Australia. I'll explain what the argument is in a second. But I'm suggesting, for my purposes, that's the most significant and interesting aspect. There's the no side. Billy Hughes in the centre there, he's going to chain you up and you're going to be deprived of your civil liberties. Again, there's a vote specifically to the women. This is the Labor Party that's doing this. The other side is the Conservative side. The Labor Party is arguing for a no vote. And they also address this issue about white Australia. And they say, vote no to conscription if you want to keep Australia white. So both sides are using it. My argument will be that the Labor side will do so most effectively in this electorate. That they will win because they played the race card the best. Okay, to put it in its simplest terms, Billy Hughes, he didn't deliver a speech in Armidale, but I'm just using this as an example. Not far from here in Sydney Town Hall on the Thursday, the 26th of October, 1916, he delivered an argument in favour of yes. And he said, I beg you go and fight for white Australia in France. Okay, we support the British win, then we've got them afterwards as our allies, and they protect us from this potential invasion. We don't want the Germans to win because goodness knows what would happen in those disruptive circumstances. So that was the kind of the yes vote. The no vote. Well, vote no and you'll keep Australia white according to the Labor side. Now they're quoting somebody who's saying, send every man out of Australia, conscript them, all the young men, even if they had to import. So when you send them out, you're going to have to import black, brown or brindle labour to do their work. That was the argument that the Labor Party used and most effectively, particularly in a rural electorate where they needed a lot of labour. And the people were being told, oh yeah, when all the young men are sent out of the country, you're going to have Chinese and goodness knows what in your country. And if you couldn't work it out before, it's not very clear, but there's all these Asian type people coming into the country according to the Labor Party or certain parts of their campaign. Now, Ian Turner says that most significant in the outcome of the vote was the vote of electorates such as that in which Armidale was found. Most significant was the New South Wales pastoral vote that carried the day for no. His argument being that Conservative electorates that returned Conservative candidates, Parliament, members of Parliament, and they voted for yes. Armidale had been like that before the election, it was. And it had normally voted 60% for a Conservative member of Parliament. Anyway, Turner is saying usually they continue to vote that way. Now, in a working class electorate, typically they voted no. And what Armidale did is it swung around. But rather than voting Conservative for yes, they voted about 60% for no. And he's saying that whereas most of Australia remains stable in its voting patterns, not places like Armidale. Okay, an example of the yes vote. This Anglican minister in the cathedral, Anglican Cathedral in Armidale, what's his name, the Reverend Canon Forster, English born, went in the Catholic cathedral you got people, Irishmen, who were the minister of religion, the priests, and in the Protestant church it's more likely to be people who were born in England. Anyway, Reverend Canon Forster says it was incumbent upon Australians to surrender their civil liberties and submit themselves to conscription for the continued existence of not just our empire, but our God-entrusted empire. We've got God on our side. That's what we need. God wants you to have conscription. The Mayor of Armidale, the Methodist Mayor William Curtis, head of the Yes campaign, he said in his speech, it now rested with the people as to whether their country would continue to range alongside Britain, support Britain and her allies, or sink into the background of dishonour. You have to keep up the faith. You've said you're going to support them and you can't pull out of your word. The types of people who were in the Universal Service League included 3 Protestant ministers. Catholic priests never were on the public platform. They weren't allowed to, but the Protestants were supporting conscription. 3 medical practitioners, an architect, a builder, the local postmaster, store owners and graziers. They were typically on the Conservative side of politics and they argued for a yes vote. On the no side, led by the Labor Party. They were told, farmers and graziers, that 60,000 men engaged in the Australian pastoral industry would be conscripted. There would be no shearers to shear the sheep, and there'd be nobody to bring in the wheat harvest. So that's the Labor Party speech that was delivered aimed at a significant portion of the electorate. The Labor Party sent various speakers to speak in Armidale, and they emphasised that as a result of conscription there will be a manpower shortage created by conscription. Well, this person obviously didn't know too much about the Maltese, TD much, and he drew attention to a large number of Maltese who had recently arrived in Australia. So they thought this was an example of black or yellow labour, and anyway, he used that in his speech. Frank Foster, a local, he said that coloured labour and Chinese, I keep on emphasising, it's gradually going to shift towards the Japanese, but coloured labour and Chinese coolies will be introduced. And this next local, Cyril Guest, addressed lots of meetings, 14, with a racist argument. He said if conscription was introduced, Australia will be inundated by the Chinese and other aliens. Now the crunch line, and racially mixed marriages would abound. How terrible. Australia no longer would be white because of mixed marriages. You'd have the children of all these marriages. What a terrible blot on white Australia. Okay, gradually, but this one is veiled. A speaker of the No campaign said if conscription, I was ex-senator after Ray comes to Armidale, he said if conscription were introduced, the resulting shipment of men of military age to Europe would leave Australia open to invasion, and he alluded to Japan. He didn't spell it out, but kind of like the people knew. Okay, on the 28th of October, the first conscription campaign, the No side wins locally by 62.2%. Previously, about that many had voted for the Conservative candidate, and they should have voted yes, but they didn't. I'm suggesting they were won over by the Labor Party campaign, particularly its racist aspects, and they were rather cock-a-hoop, the Labor side of politics. Okay, I'm just picking it. In the second referendum, Hughes decides to go for it again. And the most controversial speech of the period was that delivered by James Howard Katz. Now, prior to this time, he'd been in charge of voluntary recruiting in New South Wales and organised some highly successful route marches of country volunteers. He was in for fighting the war. He wanted to defeat the Germans, but he was opposed to conscription. You could be supportive of the war, but nevertheless argue for a no vote. Now, the most controversial speech of the campaign was delivered by him. He drew attention to the coloured hordes of Asia, to the Japanese in particular. Okay, he spells it out. He says who they are. He predicted evil days ahead when these coloured hordes would attempt to overrun Australia. Conscription would leave Australia at the mercy of Japan. And as a result of this, I think 7 or 8 times Hughes took him to court because he was threatening our relations with an ally, Japan. And somewhere along the way, the word annexed was used. He was saying that Japanese foreign policy would have resulted in the annexation of Australia. I'll just simply make this point again, that being opposed to conscription like he was didn't mean that you're opposed to the war, far from it. But historians, some academics argue, oh gee, a no vote equals you're rejecting fighting in the war. No, I don't follow that at all. This time, it wasn't a strong no vote, but it was a no vote anyway locally, 55.3%. It was generally believed at the time that, the kind of general conversation that conscription was defeated by the Catholics, the cowards, and the women in society. That was the kind of general formula that the Protestants came up with. Okay. As a result of the conscription referenda, the relative religious harmony of the early war years was destroyed. Armidale's Protestant ministers would enter energetically into the campaigns, denouncing those who opposed the introduction of conscription. It was a Catholic lay community with its links to the Labor Party, which provided much of the public opposition to conscription. I just want to a few examples of the discord that came about. Okay, something happened on the steps of Armidale Post Office on the 9th of January 1918. Thomas Murphy, a Catholic, was going along and he made a statement like, every man is entitled to his own opinion. That's what the vote is given for. I voted no myself, though I volunteered myself several times. Now the hearing the conversation that became involved was a Protestant who was a dentist, Robert Simpson, and he said, you're a low-down mongrel, Irish mongrel. You never did a day's work since you came to Armidale. He said Murphy was drunk. And Murphy kind of swung punches at him and fell off his feet, and the other bloke covered up. And anyway, there was a court case about it. So this is showing how bubbled the service, and there were tensions within the community. based upon a kind of religion. The Irish Easter Rebellion of the 24th to the 29th of April 1916, if you look at the top of the slide there, the significant thing is 15 of the Irish rebels were captured and executed by British troops. That caused a lot of animosity. In Armidale, sectarian animosities were exacerbated by the belated impact made upon the community by the Irish Rebellion. Irish Catholic sympathy was expressed eventually for the rebels, not straight away because it was believed to have been a German plot, but about 15 months later it bubbles to the surface. Conversely, the Protestant community roundly applauded the execution of the rebel leaders. Protestants were so incensed by the affair that they accused Catholics who sympathised with the fate of the rebels of treason and collaboration with the Germans. Now, 15 months afterwards, at the annual general meeting of the New England Irish National Association, it was reported in the press that on Monday, the 2nd of July, the Irish-born local Catholic priest, Michael Foley, he said he'd spoken to a priest out here in Australia who had been in Dublin during the rebellion, declared the whole example was an example of British atrocities and British savagery. And then letters appeared in the press, largely written by prominent Protestants, condemning Father Foley, written by high-profile Protestants. The Anglican Reverend Foster wanted to know in what capacity Father Foley was acting when he publicly supported the cause of men who allied themselves with Germany against the Empire. And then 3 weeks later, on the 24th of July 17, the local Presbyterian ministry introduced Mr. James Robinson, the past Grand Master of the Orange Lodge of New South Wales, to a crowded meeting in the town hall. And in his address he posed the question, why is Ireland always in a state of unrest? And the answer he gave is, because of the Roman Catholic Church. So these sectarian divisions, which have been in the community before the war and are repressed, they were certainly resurrected themselves and were stronger than ever as the war went on. But I must emphasise again that the community nevertheless continued to support Australia's involvement in the war. But as far as these divisions are concerned, back to usual. Okay, a divided community. It was basically a division along religious lines, Catholics versus Protestants. The Catholic component had an essentially working class background with links to the Labor Party. The Protestant component of the division, which was most visible, comprised the leading professional businessmen of the community. These men had links with the anti-Labor parties. The last thing I just want to go back to a war memorial. Now, in the background there, you can see the Boer War Memorial, and this set certain precedents. They decided after the war that they were going to again build another war memorial. That's the one that they built, and none of the names, as I said beforehand, had any indication they died in the war. The community was simply proud of them. The whole community came together again to build this war memorial. It's kind of like overcoming some of the divisions. And if you would like to read that, that's the conclusion that I come up with. Nothing very startling. I'm simply saying that there were potential fault lines there, and but nevertheless, early on, they put aside their differences, but eventually they resurrected themselves, these divisions, and Armidale returned to normal, these types of divisions, and I think my time will be up. So, the end.
Thank you, David. We have a short amount of time for a few questions.
Home country. I'm reminded, I used to work with Bruce Williams, who was Vice Chancellor of Sydney University, and we were talking about the war, and he was referring to when Australian troops were brought back from the Middle East to fight the Japanese. And he lived in Adelaide at the time, and I remember he said that his mother said that was wrong, they should defend the mother country first. And that was in the mid 1942-43. So at least as strong as that, there was still the idea that the defence of Britain should take precedence over the defence of Australia.
Very important. Yes.
In Britain, during the time, there was a great movement of the white feather for anyone who didn't go.
There's a little bit of that now.
But it didn't catch on so much in Australia.
There's some evidence of it, and this is not quite the same as that, but they had dancers on in Armidale with locals towards the end of the war, and then all of a sudden, with the young men coming to the dancing, a military detachment arrived and give a speech and refer to these young men, why aren't you enlisting? So yes, there were white feathers, and people were targeted because of their age who had not enlisted. Yep.
Just a question, were you able to also look at the AIF postal vote return, even holistically, to get what they actually thought?
The argument is, isn't it, that the troops at the front were opposed to the conscription?
Well, that was my understanding, but I thought when you were doing this, you may have been able to analyse.
No, sorry, I didn't get any feeling for that at all. I'm sorry. No, I'm only dealing with their dossiers, and there's no indication on that as to what way they voted or not. Yeah.
The larger issue after the second referendum,
Yeah.
there was a drop in the
Yeah, it was pretty much, except for when the German offensive
in
occurred.
Now, was that not so much that people didn't want to enlist due to their patriotism? Was it more that most of the men already enlisted?
Exactly, yes.
That
Most had enlisted, and those who wanted to enlist had enlisted, and there would be a whole lots of reasons why those who hadn't, they had families to look after or...
There's no correlation between the drop of number and the reaction to the referendum around patriotism.
No, it was just those who wanted to enlist had enlisted. There was hardly any more to go.
So the pool was...
Yeah, unless all of a sudden you turned 18 or something and then it became available. They just about squeezed the...
That's, I just want to
Yeah.
confirm that.
Yeah, well, sorry, I can't... I'll simply say that's my interpretation. Yeah. Anybody else? Does somebody want to attack me on my... Yep.
What's the point of having conscription when you get so many kids going who are petrified, who can't fight, who just lie there and
No,
cry?
I don't think they were petrified. They read about...
I knew some
They-
unknown American soldier
Yeah.
who was walking through King's Cross, a car backfired and he threw himself on the ground and got sobbed.
Yeah.
What was the point in him being
Okay, I'm simply saying that they were impressed by things like newspaper articles that said how brave Australian troops were.
Yeah.
The Turks were running away before them. That's all I can say. They had no experience of war, these people, and were dealing with propaganda for them to enlist. Yeah.
Perhaps to answer that a little bit, having my some of my relatives who were alive and I interviewed, look, they were supportive of Australia and the home country, but most of them went over there, to be honest, my relatives. They were actually, it was a bit of an adventure to start off with.
Exactly, yeah.
And then more family members joined as time went on because of the casualties in their own family members. But it doesn't matter what war you're in. Most people react and actually get on with the job. Post-trauma stress is an entirely different thing, and I suspect that shell shock was actually much higher at the time, but that a lot of the casualties and things actually took out a lot of people who had it.
There's a problem with shell shock is that all the medical records have been left in Britain and they were destroyed. All you're dealing with here is just dossiers, and they do have some medical information in it, but only cursory. Yep.
I think I'm a health officer in the Defence Force. I think that there's also a component that people at the time didn't speak about such things, and the trauma that soldiers brought home from war was largely dealt with locally, personally or privately, or unsuccessfully.
And in addition to that,
with a bottle of alcohol or whatever it was.
at an official level, they wanted to
We
repress.
speak about it very openly now.
The official level, the British didn't want it to be discussed.
Like a moral failure.
Yes.
David, your figures suggest that by 1918, insufficient men from Armidale were enlisting to reinforce the AIF, and that would have been to the detriment of the Australian Corps.
Well, they didn't have enough to supplement their figures because of the death rate in 19, because of the offensives that went on. They couldn't replace their troops.
Conscription would have fixed that.
Yeah, well, that's what the argument was in favour of it by Bill Hughes. Yeah, That's why he wanted to introduce it. Yeah.
The other factor is, out of all that, was that there was another almost division's worth of strength in England in training camps, which is why they, for a brief period of time, they formed the 6th Division, which resurrected itself in 1939.
You mentioned that 18% died.
Yeah.
But you said on that memorial, there was no aspect
Yeah, exactly.
to indicate that. So
Because as far as the community was concerned, what they wanted to remember was the people.
I see.
The
People
people
had died, but they didn't.
They knew who had died. They had the figures. They knew exactly who had been killed. They didn't put it on their memorial. And I'm trying to say, my take on that is that the community was proud of their troops and wanted all their names to be commemorated. Whereas a modern day historian would want to say, oh, gee, look at all these people who were killed. That's why they constructed the memorial. I'm saying, well, as far as I'm concerned, that's not why they constructed that memorial, because they were proud of their local troops.
They're proud of the sons of Armidale who've gone.
Yeah. Last question. Yeah.
But not indicate some had died.
They didn't indicate. They knew who they were, but they didn't do it.
I think most communities to the heartbeat.
I'll just make the final comment. You didn't stress it during your talk, but conscription actually was already in Australia after Federation. It didn't go away during the war. It was just that those people who were in the CMF actually could only serve in Australia.
Yep.
So there were lots of people who didn't join the AIF, but they were actually already in the CMF. But they may have been in protected industries, or they may not have agreed with serving overseas. So in the holistic view of this, there are actually a lot more people, a lot more married people as well, would have been in the CMF.
Thank you, David, for a very illuminating
Thank you.
talk.